The padded board is a type of textile mount consisting of a rigid board, such as blue board or rag board, tightly covered in fabric. This stretched and tensioned fabric creates a secure base on which to stitch a textile, allowing it to be displayed vertically. The padded board is typically the preferred method for mounting lightweight textiles, such as silks and samplers. Different institutions may have differing techniques they prefer to use to construct these boards. For this demonstration, we'll be constructing a padded board that is completely stitched in a manner that secures the show fabric to the board itself. Here you can see an example that has been constructed by wrapping the fabric around the board and gluing it to the back side. While this technique is simple and requires no stitching, it does not create the tensioned surface which may be necessary for stitch work. Tools and materials. The materials needed for this mount are supplied in your course kit. You will need a piece of blue board, a T-square or ruler, polyester felt, a half yard of washed and ironed muslin. For this demonstration, you will be using simple muslin, but in a professional setting, the fabric will likely be selected by the exhibition designer. Glass weights, scissors. I typically have a variety of sizes on hand. Bone folders and spatulas are helpful in folding and tucking the show fabric around the board. Pins. Here I have a variety of glass head and small pins. Sturdier pins are preferred as they are rigid enough to withstand pinning into the board. Straight and curved sewing needles for the mount, and a beading needle to attach the textile sample to the completed board. Hot melt glue, and finally, a straight blade, such as an X-Acto knife. Process. Please note that certain parts of this video have been sped up to keep the demonstration length to under an hour. If you'd like to see the work done slower, you can use the controls at the bottom of the player to adjust the playback speed or pause at any time. Let's start by cutting the board. In a museum setting, the size of the board will be determined in consult with the exhibition designer. For the purposes of this demonstration project, we will cut our boards to an 8-inch by 10-inch rectangle. Make use of a T-square and ruler to ensure that all sides are completely straight. Note that for larger projects, it may be necessary to laminate two boards together to create a surface rigid enough for mounting. Here you can see me cutting the board and trimming the edges. Note that sometimes other materials other than blue board are used to create flat mounts. Some institutions, like the Smithsonian, use plexiglass for their mounts. Unfortunately, this prevents the mount from being able to be stitched closed. Next, lay the cut board atop the poly felt. Cut the poly felt slightly larger than your board, about 1 inch larger on all sides. Flip the board over so the white side is facing up. Place the poly felt on the board, smoothing and stretching it slightly. At this point, you can dab a tiny amount of hot melt on the surface of the board to tack the felt in place. This helps it stay in place during the remainder of the construction process. Be sure to use the smallest amount of glue possible to ensure that the glue doesn't show through the front of the mount. Once it's secure, you can flip it over and trim the felt closely to the edge. The The next step is measuring and cutting the textile. You will be using your muslin as a show fabric. For this demonstration video, I have chosen a darker fabric that will show up better on camera. The process will be the same regardless of the fabric chosen. I am using the board itself as a guide for measuring, but you can use a ruler if you prefer. Make sure that the warp and weft directions of the fabric are aligned to the vertical and horizontal axis of the board. Your fabric should be cut to allow for a 1.5 inch seam allowance on the short sides. That's the 8-inch side on the board that we're working with, the top and the bottom. The longer sides should be cut to allow for the board to be wrapped with the edges meeting on the reverse, plus an additional 3 inches to allow for a generous seam allowance. This extra fabric will be useful later when we tension the fabric around the board. Marking the grain. This step is optional, but I am demonstrating it here for your edification. Throughout this process, it will be important to keep the fabric on grain so the warp and weft align perfectly with the vertical and horizontal directions of the board. This can be done by eye, but for larger projects, it may be helpful to mark the grain visually to assist with maintaining the correct orientation of the show fabric. Here I have pinned my fabric to my surface to keep it perfectly flat. Using straight pins and contrasting thread, I am marking straight lines in the warp and weft direction. The pins are inserted into the textile with the points facing towards the center and used as a tiny cleat to wrap the threads in a figure 8. The thread is then stretched to the opposite end and wrapped in another figure 8, creating a straight line. These lines act as guides for the large basting stitches also done in contrasting thread, which can later be used to check alignment. After the mount is completed, these basting stitches can be removed. Now you'll notice that the line looks slightly angled here, but that's because of the camera angle. The camera was above my head and not absolutely flat. So again, insert the pin towards the center. I'm checking the measurements. Inserting the other pin. I'm also using my eye here to make sure that I'm absolutely following the grain. Now here I'm wrapping in a figure 8. And there you can see wrapping with the up to the other side. This technique is also really useful in textile conservation in general, whenever you need to sew a straight line or anytime you might need a guide when you're working. Okay, next step. We are going to begin wrapping the fabric around the board. This process involves repeated campaigns of pinning and pulling from the back to create a smooth, tight surface across the front. And here you can see that I'm marking straight lines in the horizontal and vertical direction so that I can align that with my fabric. We'll begin working in the longer direction. That's the 10-inch side for the board that we're working on. This is the one for which we cut the additional 3-inch seam allowance. As you can see, I'm overlapping the ends and pinning them in place. And this is really just to hold the fabric to the board so that I can begin pulling. So now you can see that I'm pulling, trying to get some tension on the fabric, pinning it to the other side, and then I'm just going to keep working and pulling and pinning until I get a nice smooth surface across the front side of the board. Once I've achieved good tension across the surface, I can begin preparing this raw edge for stitching. So here you can see I'm folding this raw edge under. Now you can see that this edge isn't exactly under tension, it's quite loose. The rest of the show fabric's being held in tension by the pins I have around the edge. Now I need to find a way to create tension along this seam so that when I stitch it, it doesn't become loose. First, I'm going to just tuck the raw edge under, and you can see that a spatula comes in very handy to flatten out all those yarns. Now you can see that I'm placing the pins towards me to hold that fold in place. Now, to make sure that I get tension along that join, I'm going to use the pins as a sort of lever. So I'm beginning by placing the pins into the fold pointing towards my body. I'm then going to flip the pins, essentially using a rocking motion to pull the fold towards my body about a 1/16 to an 1/8 of an inch. And in the next segment, I'll slow this down so that you'll be able to see this process at a little bit more clearly. So here, placing the pin towards me and rocking it, and then inserting it into the board. So towards me and then away. towards the body and then rocking it away and into the board. And you can see how nice and tight that seam looks once it's been tensioned. You'll notice as you do this that the fabric will stretch slightly, and this is the telltale sign that you've done the technique correctly. Once the wrapping is completed, your board should look like this. Now we can commence stitching. You can use almost any type of stitch to secure the fold. Your handout recommends a herringbone or a whip stitch. I am using herringbone stitch here, mainly because I like how it evens the tension across the seam, allowing for a smooth, straight, and flat finish. I am using a contrasting thread so you can see my work. In a professional setting, you would use a coordinating thread that would not be as visible. Here I am working with a curved needle. Now you could try to do this with a straight needle, but it would probably bend. I'm also using a beading needle here because of the tightness of the weave made it impossible for me to use a curved quilting needle. You might be able to use a curved quilting needle for this seam if you're using your muslin. So here you can see I'm removing the pins as I go. If you're worried about the tension, you can also put additional pins around the margins of the board into the sides while you're working. The final step is finishing the short ends of the board. Here we will essentially be folding the ends inside towards the board, but tucking both allowances towards the back side to ensure that the front remains smooth. So here you can see me tucking the front edges towards the back and pinning them. And I'm going to continue working the fabric with my fingers and the pins to improve the tension in the direction that I'm working. Now I'm working the back side. I'm tucking the back side. I'm beginning by using a bone folder to tuck the back side towards the back. So both the front and the back are meeting on the back side of the board. I'm folding this so that the fold is about 1/8 to 1/4 inch shorter than the edge of the board. This will allow me to pull and tension this direction later. So by pulling the back side, the back fold towards the edge as I'm stitching, I'll be able to get a nice smooth surface in that direction, in the horizontal direction. So here you can see I'm working the fabric in, pulling, pinning, pulling, and pinning. Ideally, you want the fold to be stretched slightly so that it aligns perfectly with the edge of the board. So you have a nice clean line there. Now you can see that I'm working the inside corners. The fabric here can have a tendency to kind of crumble or crumple inside. You want it to lie as flat as possible so that in the event that your padded board is just lying on a horizontal surface, that it lies perfectly flat. This can take some time. Here, I have this video slightly sped up, but it definitely took me several minutes to get each of these inside corners worked so that the seam allowances inside were completely flat. Any type of flat tool can work here. You could use a bone folder. I'm using a spatula. Sometimes a bone awl can be helpful if you have a fold that you need to sort of smooth out and push into the one of the edges. June recommends using a credit card. That's also an option. So here you can see I'm pulling, tucking, trying to get that edge as flat and tight as possible. And now to the final side. You can see me tucking towards the back. I think I had to sneeze there. I'm using these longer pins to hold that excess fabric, and then I'm going to use the same technique with the rocking of the pins to pull that edge, that folded edge, towards the edge of the board. And there you can see that same rocking motion is really going to help hold the tension across that in that direction on the board. It's also going to help me stretching the fabric as much as possible helps to create those nice smooth corners. Now here you can see that my board is all pinned and I'm ready to finish stitching the ends. Now I have this sped up quite a bit. This process actually took me about 20 to 30 minutes. So I have it sped up quite a bit here. You can use, again, you can use any stitch here. I'm using a whip stitch. You could also use an invisible sort of stitch. Again, you're going to want to use a thread that matches your fabric and is as inconspicuous as possible. I'm using a contrasting thread here just so that you all can see what the finished work looks like. And you can use cotton thread or polyester thread here. Here's just a little bit of a normal speed so you can see how I work. And I'm continuing to tuck in the corners as I stitch just to really finesse them in there. And again, you can use poly thread, Gutermann, you could use cotton thread. It's really going to depend on the show fabric itself. So here we have our finished board, perfectly flat, and it's ready for mounting. So the next step is going to be placing your textile sample on the board. Now, the placement and the amount of margin around the textile is also going to be something that you're probably going to discuss with the exhibition designer. Some exhibition designers are going to want a wide margin around the textile, some are going to want hardly any. Likewise, stitching the textile to the board the type of stitch you use, the type of thread you use is going to be determined by the object itself. So if you have a very lightweight silk textile like I have here, you might use a hair silk. If you have a heavier textile, you might use cotton. A curved beading needle is generally used to attach the textile to the board.